Eye on Gauteng, brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Economic Development.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Eye on Gauteng. I'm Lionel Skink. Thanks for joining us. Now, Eye on Gauteng is a show that investigates the business, investment and economic story of Africa's biggest economy, the Gauteng province. Now, as the world looks for other opportunities in these trying economic times, Africa is looking all the more alluring, and the Gauteng province in particular is strategically placed to act as a gateway to the continent. Or is it? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing this evening here on Eye on Gauteng. And joining us to shed some light on whether or not Gauteng can indeed be the bridge between Africa and the rest of the world is Group Executive for Marketing and Communications at Blue IQ, Stephen Watson, Associate Director of Africa Business Center at Ernst & Young, Victor Khomo Eswana, and Zolani Matebese, Head of Broadband in the city of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start with Blue IQ, Stephen. What exactly do you do at Blue IQ? And why is it that Blue IQ has taken the whole responsibility of broadband and somebody else is doing it? But let's just start with Blue IQ.
Look, I mean, Blue IQ's mandate is to focus on strategic economic infrastructure enablers within the province that typically wouldn't be invested in by the private sector, that can have the right catalytic and stimulative effect to improve the cost of doing business in the economy, and importantly, not only to just grow the economy, but to absorb employment within the economy. That's the mandate. That's what we typically stick to. To go back to broadband, our role, and which is often the case, even if we take Gauteng, for example, is we do the feasibility studies and assessment to really unpack the need for strategic economic infrastructure. And in the instance of broadband, if we go all the way back to when it was going to be called B-Link, then changed to G-Link, really we got involved in the feasibility. And once we could tangibly demonstrate through research the impact that a broadband rollout would have, the implementation in this case was handed over to the GSSC, who later attempted to partner with GFC. In the interim, of course, at the front line, you've got the cities. And Gauteng is blessed in that we've got 3 major metropolitan cities, and the cities were implementing at the front line strategies that fitted their economic development and focus. So
the cities have taken over?
Yeah, in essence, I think there's a city focus on the infrastructure needs. I think that there's a renewed role that the provincial government must play in attempting to ensure that there's the right cohesion between the stakeholders, and that if there are gaps that don't necessarily fit the priorities of the city, that we as the province then look at the greater benefit of that for the province and fill those gaps.
Well, that's quite an interesting discussion. I think we'll get back to the whole broadband thing, because broadband is very important with regards to economic development. Now, I'd like to turn my attention to Victor. Victor, you obviously are traveling a lot on the continent, and you've seen other geographically placed cities in the globe that are gateways to a particular country. And we are hearing that Gauteng is poised to be a very important gateway to the rest of the continent. What are the characteristics of a typical gateway city or region?
Well, think about it. By the way, it's good to be here. It is important to think about geographic proximity with regard to where the investors are coming from. Now, if you look at what has been happening over the past 5 years, investors have been coming increasingly from China, from India, and from Brazil. And yes, to an extent from Russia, United Arab Emirates, and the Middle East. Now, if you just think of Africa as a continent, South Africa is down there at the bottom. And to be the gateway to the continent, you have to look around you and see who else is challenging that status. And at the moment, Nairobi is challenging because it's better positioned with regard to India and China.
You mean it's a short haul
geographically
flight?
It's a shorter
flight from okay.
It's a shorter flight from China to Nairobi. It's a shorter flight from from India, any of the Indian cities, to Nairobi. And most of all, there is Mozambique, the northern part of Mozambique, Nacala, building an airport there as well. That will make the flight from China to move from over 10 hours to less than 10 hours, which means even Johannesburg, for people flying from Mozambique or into Mozambique, because that's been attracting a lot of investment, will be having the choice of flying via Johannesburg, which is in Gauteng, or flying via Nacala, or which is not far from Nairobi up north. And of course, you think about places like Ghana on the west coast with regard to the Western, in other words, coming from Brazil, coming from the US, coming from Canada. There are countries like Senegal, which are saying we are the farthest to the west you can get. So if you are dealing with us from the west, across the Atlantic, that is, Senegal is saying we are a better position. And Nigeria, being in the top 3 in terms of size as an economy, and 155 million people, is saying, well, why would you not fly 6 hours from Amsterdam or from Paris to Lagos, and you'd rather fly more than 10 hours to Johannesburg and then only to come back here? So if you look at what is happening, it is not a given that Gauteng will remain the gateway. And I'm only talking about physical or geographic proximity. I'm not talking about the airlines. Kenya Airways flies to more destinations on the continent than any other African airline, and it is connected via the alliance to European airlines. It is buying more and more routes, getting into more and more countries and more destinations.
But Victor,
So
I think we'll talk a little bit more about why those countries are better placed to be a gateway. But Africa is not for sissies, and everybody knows that. And some of our investors, they love the fact that we have the best amenities on the continent, and this is where I want to bring you in. City of Johannesburg, it's a world-class city, and you are ahead of the broadband strategy for the city. Do you think the fact that we have this strategy for broadband that will bring people to South Africa and say, look, I want to at least use Johannesburg or Gauteng as my gateway, because you have all that going for the city as far as connectivity?
Thank you, Lionel. I definitely think so. If you look at it, it's not only a strategy. We've positioned ourselves, the city of Johannesburg, as being a world-class city. We're actually moving towards being a world-class smart city, wherein you have access to any given kind of communications technology that you would have anywhere in the so-called first world. To that end, we are implementing a full-scale triple play broadband network to actually reach out through the entire Johannesburg geographic area, so that we can better service our ratepayers and our citizens.
Okay, well, it's all about creating an enabling environment, is it not, Stephen? Victor's brought up some really important points of why. I mean, you can't do anything about your geographical location, but as far as investors, what does a typical investor want?
Just before I address the typical investor, I think the key message that certainly I take away from Victor's statements is that we can never afford to be complacent. We certainly have been ahead of the game in terms of infrastructure, but he's right to point out that other African countries have a very aggressive plan for growth and a very aggressive plan to position themselves in what is seen as an emerging market, an untapped emerging market on the continent. And across our cost of doing business and our infrastructure, we cannot afford to rest on our laurels. We've got to keep aggressively going. And then to come directly to your question, what does any investor look at in a climate, particularly Africa has always been perceived as a risky climate? We're going to have challenges in terms of the volatility of our currency, and there's a lot of people who have various different opinions on how we should try and control that, whether it should be pegged to the dollar. They want to know that if they invest their money in the country, that they can get their money out. They want to ensure that there is the right infrastructure to be able to operate the business.
But from the track record, Stephen, the typical investor that comes to Gauteng, I'm sure you've seen some of them, are they happy when they come here? Are they happy to be here? And do they stay here?
Yeah, I think there is certainly a lot of retention in the province. Of course, we have seen businesses leave, perhaps not the ideal geographic location for them. But I mean, we can touch on many new businesses that, the Walmart transaction comes to point. This is a massive investment. We still have, even though there's been some crisis in Japan, we still have the automotive manufacturers investing in the province. But we simply cannot rest on our laurels. In the broadband and in the ICT space, there's a lot of interest in Gauteng, not Gauteng alone, in South Africa generically. I think the most important thing is we've got to create an environment which is competitive, not just competitive with the continent, but competitive globally. And if a company is going to invest, we need to make sure our tax incentives and our forex schemes and our reserve control schemes are friendly enough for them to be able to extract the benefit of that investment.
Is that happening, according to you? Is that happening?
Yeah, I think Victor can. I mean, I've sat in many of his presentations on the various incentives of using South Africa as a platform into Africa. There's various tax breaks, there's various relaxations in terms of exchange control. But you have to be a citizen. You know, if you're going to come here and you're going to operate an office, then you must contribute to the overall growth of the of the government, and of course empowerment. And you must embrace the African context of business.
Victor, I mean, obviously you tell the people what they need to know if they want to go into the rest of the continent. And I was speaking to Zolani just now about broadband, and there's a small African country that's competing for honors in as far as the IT space is concerned. You want to just tell us about that?
Well, the country, I think is it in East Africa? Well, I have to make sure you're talking about the country I'm thinking
It's a trick question. I want to see how good is your general knowledge.
No, I'm avoiding talking about it because I've almost sounded like I'm the ambassador.
Okay, which country is this? Rwanda?
This country is Rwanda, right? And you're talking about broadband, access to the internet, not just for the metropolitan centers. Rwanda is a small country, luckily. It's not the size of South Africa, so you can't really compare South Africa to it. But the mere fact that all 23 districts, in February already, when I was there, they said we've spent $95 million to make sure that underground, every corner of Rwanda has access to fiber optic cabling before they even have the technology. Now, I'm not a techie, but this is like building a railroad system that reaches every corner of your country before you have the trains that run over there. If
Zolani, are you worried?
Forward thinking.
I mean, we all have to compete.
So
right?
you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Now, Johannesburg is a city you can round. If you are a good runner, you can run around it in one day, right? And I'm a proud resident of Johannesburg. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying, but if you live in certain parts of Johannesburg, you don't have access to high-speed internet. This is a small city. I'm talking about a whole country that's still less than 20% urbanized. It's still more than 80% rural. And they already have the network before they get... I mean, tell me something I'm missing here.
All right, Zolani, are you worried about that? I mean, is competition good for Africa's world-class city, Johannesburg?
I think the competition is good. Competition always makes you raise your game. In terms of us being worried from a geographical ICT perspective, I don't think so. I think that in a number of areas within Johannesburg, we've got facilities that equal, and in some cases even better, your so-called first world countries. What we do have is a problem with, as you know it, the digital divide. You know, in the increasing digitization of our world, you have a certain strata of society that's actually being left behind due to possible spatial issues, due to economic issues, and that's where we have to look at. That's where we have to look at making an intervention. In some countries...
Do you think that's a city function or is it a more provincial function?
I think it's a function of government. And we have 3 spheres of government, and it doesn't really matter which sphere of government actually does the work, as long as the work is done. You know, Province had a good idea. They started with an initiative to link up the entire province. We started our strategy and our implementation of broadband in 2006. So we've been at this road for quite a long time. And our main objective is to make sure that we can bring every citizen within Johannesburg access to internet and to connectivity. We've begun a slogan within the project, which is that access to connectivity is now a basic human right.
All right.
And
we'll talk about the economic spin-offs of having access to internet when we come back from the break.